Yeah.
Well, it could literally be just like if you train after work, you could just those 2 meals, kind of like I've got in the fortitude training, kind of one of the options there.
Yep.
And that's when you basically just try to keep yourself from losing too much during the non-training days and the meals beforehand, and then ensure an excess there, so you're just creeping forward. It's just making sure that those 2 meals aren't too much. Where's the kind of sweet spot?
And it seems
the
for
back and
me at
forth.
least, it's more of like a chronic. It's not typically like, oh, I have one big meal and I'm horrible. It's more the chronic cutting really seems to
Okay.
be good, and the chronic surplus seems to be bad. So I'll have to play around with it. Obviously, I think if I keep it moderate, but so you think keep like basically full intensity, do the pulses and everything, and just try to center those calories I can have more around the workouts.
Yeah, what you just said before you asked about the training is that yeah, you can get it. It's the chronically pushing with an excess, over the overloading day in and day out and meal in and meal out, that tends to wear down your GI and sort of bring about the symptoms. So yeah, if you can get away with a couple meals, and you can fit it all in there, and of course you hopefully sort of built up some gastrointestinal resources. It's
Right.
ready to and you'll be hungry. A
Yeah.
little bit. I like to have, even when during the off season, I like to have my clients hungry when
Hmm.
they go in, like a little bit, like they're looking forward to that big. And some people put down 1,000 grams of carbs in those 2 meals.
Yeah.
So they put in
Yeah.
a lot of food. But that's the way to do it. And yeah, I would just put the pulses. Are you going to have a partner, a training partner?
No.
Okay, so the part of, you can do it. I've done it this way before. You don't. It does change things a little bit when you do. The idea is that you start on a negative, and then when you fail, you would like literally finish that negative as long as it's safe. So you're in like a rack if you're doing this alone, or you've got a partner. And then when you start the second set, literally, like if you're on a hammer strength, your partner would pull the weight up so you can start on the negative. And then you go and you fail, and then you drive until you come down, and then you're done and you come out. So a partner was
How do they
always going
do that with, like incline bench, for example, is an allowed movement. So
right.
if you're supposed to finish on a negative, you have the partner then bring up that last one.
Yeah, or I would always use a Smith machine, and I've done it with actually barbells before. I would literally rack it on the. There's times when I would just clean it down to my thighs, and then literally clean the weight up, put it back up there. I've done
So
that
like,
before. That's not
yeah,
very
like if you
fun.
did incline Smith and I finished on a negative, during my 10 to 15 breaths, I might like stand over it and lift it up so I can start back up at the top.
And that's and part of the reason, like in fortitude training, I have people when they're doing the loading sets, and you got the rest intervals, and you may be going back and forth, or you change the way to have you. I have them start the rest interval when they're actually resting.
Right.
Yeah, so that the kind of that idea is something that I always employed when I was doing
Oh,
DC
I see
training
what
by
you're saying.
myself.
Okay.
Is that so I finished on the negative, I got to get up and like deadlift that thing back up to the starting point.
Then you
Then I
start.
would start my breaths, because
Right.
if I started like my breathing, then I would be through
Yeah.
8 of the breaths, and then I would only
Right.
have like another 5. And like shit,
That's why I
definitely didn't
always
work.
say in my mind, and this is just semantics, it doesn't matter. But in my mind, DC training, like a rest pause set, is kind of like 3 sets, right? I mean, because you think of these big guys, I mean, like each breath is like 3 seconds. So you're talking probably realistically 45 to 60 seconds between sets, I would think.
It depends on what exercise. I mean,
Yeah.
that's some people just do that. I mean, people have said, I think Dusty takes longer breaks.
Hmm.
And Dusty's the go-to guy, I think, as of now. I'm no longer, I was the DC trainer years ago, but
Right.
some people would go that long. The idea is that the breast would give you some sort of a standardized
Right.
rest interval, and it's going to vary depending on the exercise.
Right.
Leg presses are different. That's why
Yeah.
I have people use the watch in DC in fortitude training, because the breasts don't always work out. But yeah, they can be that way. But the thing is, and I remember explaining this on Intense Muscle to people, because like why like the breasts and all that stuff. I'm like, and it's a function of the activation. Like those are the important reps at the end of the set when they're
Yeah.
really hard. Those are the ones that are most likely to stimulate muscle growth. Those are what we now call, per Chris Beardsley idea, the effective reps.
Yeah.
That's why cluster sets are done the way they are. There's some way to sort of harness your time while you're lifting in the most effective way, so to speak, by doing the reps that are most effortful and thus the most stimulating to muscle growth. So a
Which is
rest
interesting
pause
because
set.
it in one sense, I totally agree with it. And in another sense, then if you do consider it three different sets, the studies that we have, at least, that compare shorter to longer rest intervals seem to indicate more growth from longer rest intervals. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but they're doing like comparing like 1 minute, and these are really less than 1 minute.
Okay.
And you have to look at the studies that have looked at cluster sets.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of them. There's like Patrick Tour's SST. There's some data out there on that. One of the sets they compared in there was like pit force training. Now, if you've ever, yeah, I mean, I have. Funny enough, like this is pit force training. I literally.
Oh, look at that.
Aber das Buch ist auf Deutsch geschrieben. Ich spreche Deutsch, deswegen kann ich das verstehen. It's written in German, like there's no English translation. I speak German, so I can read this stuff. So I didn't learn to speak German so I could read this, but so one of the sets in a study I was just looking at was basically pit force is brutal. They had the people do 5 to 20 seconds. So you pick this particular study, they had them using 90% of 1 rep max, and they were getting up to 18 reps in a set. Jeez. With that. But they would rest 5 to 20 seconds. So with pit force training, you do a few. It's like a super widowmaker.
I was gonna say, yeah, it sounds like
and you just keep going, and but you rest in between until basically.
There's a what rep max?
They use 90% of a 1 rep max.
Oh,
and when because I read the details of the study, and they would progress the weight once someone could get up 18 reps or more with that. So normally, people aren't familiar. Like 90% 1 rep max is like a triple.
Yeah, right.
But they would let them pause for 5 to 20 seconds so they could recover. So they were like just putting together effective rep after and those are just, you can look up pit force, PITT-FO. It's like personal or professional intensity training technique is what that stands for. Wow. And it's just like, it's brutal. It works well for some people, but it's just brutal. It's just crazy because they're all like, you're just like trying to eke out rep after rep, and you do just one set. In that study, for instance, they didn't show the same gains as when they used Patrick Tour's rest pause type of cluster set technique. And he's got like 2 different ways he does it, and people can look that up. There's studies where they've looked at things similar to rest pause training. So there's different variations or there's so many different ways you can do cluster sets, and they're really not entirely comparable to straight sets.
Yeah, right.
Because if you do like short rest intervals, for instance, and let's say you're trying to do sets of 10 to 12, well, you're doing 1 minute's rest. In order to get 12 more reps, you're going to lower the load.
Right. For sure.
In each of those sets. Sure. So that's different than a rest pause set.
Right.
Because if we had to put our hierarchy of what are the things that contribute to growth, and mechanical tension is probably going to be at the top of the food chain, right? Yeah. So DC training does not skimp on that. And Dante's even said, if I recall correctly, that he thought about doing drop sets, but the thing about drop sets is that you're lowering the load. DC training rest pause, there's no lowering the load with a rest pause set. The whole idea is that the loads will go up over time. It's all about mechanical loading.
Do you know why he doesn't do rest pause on forearms? Is it just an injury risk?
You can do that. You can. I don't think there's. Yeah, forearms are somewhat up to you, but yeah, you don't. He doesn't want people doing rest pause on things like deadlifts or bent over rows, back thickness exercise, or squats, because just the low back. I say this. I don't want people doing cluster sets on like deadlifts, muscle rounds.
And that makes sense to me. There was an article on T Nation. I thought it would have been you. They said the initials were SM. I don't know if that was just made up, but they interviewed somebody who they wanted to interview Dante. Dante said no. This was in 2009. Of course. And he said, "You're right." And he said to talk to this guy whose initials were SM. You're the only person I could think of which is not the right initials. Scott Mendelson? Or not Scott Mendelson. Sorry, there was
the other Scott who was like Dante. He posted his so many threads.
That just popped into my head. He was on ironaddicts.com.
Yeah, he's gone. He knew everything. He could always throw you the link to what Dante said on everything. He went around and he helped more than anyone by far, police all the boards to help.
I forgot about him.
Disseminate. Wow. Yeah.
But yeah,
Scott,
they on
yeah.
that forum or on that article on T Nation, it said to only do straight sets for forearms. But I feel like forearms are plenty amenable to rest pause.
Yeah, you could. I think it's just a matter of volume. But because the thing is, he didn't have people doing any trap training either. But if
Yeah,
you're doing squats and deadlifts,
right,
and if you're doing deadlifts and heavy bent over rows and heavy all sorts of pulling movements, your forearms are going to grow pretty well
right,
anyway.
right.
So yeah, that's just kind of a technical. So the thing is with there's the standard what you read online DC training, which phenomenal program, but Dante would do different things with different people
Right, right.
depending on whatever he felt they needed. So if someone had stick forearms, I can obviously see Dante. Look, we're going to rest pause those. Right? Well, I mean, if they look really small compared
Yeah.
to their arms otherwise,
Right, right,
he would modify things to.
right,
He'd
right.
have them do like who knows what.
I used to do one of his methods. It was behind the back wrist curls, and then I'd go into. He would talk about how it was just complete torture, and I would go into like a really intense stretch and just
Hmm.
holding the barbell, and
Yeah,
then eventually let it get to the point that like it's even like down your fingers now, and it basically just falls off. And I did that. I mean, first of all, he's right. Like 60 plus seconds on that is very intense. I can't say it like really caused any growth for me. I mean, those stretches are very intense, though. I mean, they're no
yeah.
joke.
Oh yeah, they're brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
I
absolutely. They can be too much sometimes.
I
That's
think,
why I
and
have
I had
different.
this issue with fortitude training, which is probably me failing to auto-regulate them enough, was both times I'd done fortitude training, I started getting significant shoulder and pec pain, and I think I just can't do pec stretches as intense stretches, which sucks because I think they're a great, like of all the muscle groups to really intensely stretch, I think pecs are a good one. But I would try to do like the pec machine, like a pec fly, and have it really go back, and it always messed up my left shoulder or both shoulders really. I think that's probably one where I'd have to do one of your more moderate stretches for me.
You just wouldn't do that. Like if you just stopped doing it altogether,
Yeah,
that'd be my
yeah.
like. That's why I have the three set
Right,
types in
right,
there
yeah.
or
It's me being
stretch
stubborn.
types. Yeah, like no, like that's. I mean, I was just telling someone the other day who was it? Like I'll go in the gym sometimes and I'll have to try 4 or 5 exercises before I find what I can do. Some
You do?
days, yeah, oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah,
When I'm doing like muscle rounds, like,
right.
and if you have an exercise that feels weird, you just don't do it.
Mhm.
That's the nice thing about the stretches is they are totally auto-regulated in terms of whether you do an extreme stretch, whether you do
Right,
on the machine with dumbbells or an occlusion stretch. Like you
right.
never, and that's why I had a lot of people say kind of the opposite of what your experience was, is that their injuries went away
Hmm.
because they were being like that. If you want to be militaristic about following fortitude training, you never do a stretch or you never do an exercise when you think it's bringing on an overuse injury like that.
Right, right.
That's being hardcore, but
Yeah,
that's being smart so you can
right,
keep training really hard, you
right,
know?
right. I think
So
for me, I wanted everything to be in a like clearly organized thing. And in my mind, it was like, okay, it makes sense if load days have this stretch, MR days have this stretch, and occlusion days have this stretch. And so I wanted the intense stretch days to be after pump days because it was
mhm.
like, oh, all the blood flow. And so, and that's to be clear, not how you recommend doing it. But I was just like, it's just made sense in my mind. And I again, I definitely pushed it where I shouldn't have in certain
Well,
instances.
I think I have in the book, if you have no idea,
Hmm.
that's one way you could do that is like if you got a high rep stimulus on the exercises, then you would do more of an extreme stretch.
Right.
But the umbrella principle
Exactly.
would be
Right.
smart, stretch smartly.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that's the thing. Like if you're having pain, like in your clavicular pec or like your pec minor or anterior deltoid, then that means you've got plenty of stimulus there. Like you're
Right.
starting
Right.
to get like that's like muscle soreness that's sort of maybe going to a tendinosis or that it's way overstimulated because you're doing too much overhead pressing and too much
Mhm.
pressing. That's so you like there's no reason whatsoever. That's when you do a low pec stretch or
Yeah.
something like that. So that's where I think that's where people would learn to not have as many injuries because they would just do that.
Right.
You might not do any stretch. You might just do a flexibility stretch, which is just like, okay, just let me just sort of like get a little movement in here because this thing is so fucked up that I'm like
Yeah.
cradling my arm now,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it would be almost a rehab flexibility stretch. So
I think and this would be a great thing to wrap up on, is what we talked about before about, I obviously have particular GI issues, but I think it's not uncommon that some people have GI issues just from trying to gain weight in
Oh
general.
no.
You've talked quite a bit in Fortitude training about intra-workouts and peri-workout nutrition and the importance of that. I, in my skeptical nature, have kind of come to the belief of like, well, a lot of this doesn't matter. If you have a full meal beforehand and a full meal afterwards, you're fine. But let's say, either from my particular case or in general, somebody really is trying to maximize their growth with minimal stimulation and like fullness throughout the day. I like what you said, like you want to go into that peri-workout period hungry. I personally don't like to go in really full. And I think I remember in the past you said you had experimented with like 2,000 calorie shakes and stuff, which can be kind of gross on, those heavy high volume days.
Yeah.
So how would you, do you believe in like the things like the highly branched cyclic dextrin and a lot of these intra workouts? Like how would you really structure something, but let's say in a case like me, just that it's the most relatable?
So context is everything. And you're absolutely right. The whole idea of an intra-workout or a peri-workout recovery supplement is to have those nutrients available to bring on recovery in terms of restoration of muscle glycogen, or having protein available for protein synthesis and inhibition of protein breakdown, to have an insulin effect, all those things. For instance, right when you're no longer training a muscle group. So if you're doing chest, shoulders, and triceps in a day, this example I usually give, your chest training is done after the first half an hour of your workout. Well, then you've got those other muscles to train, and maybe you do abs, and by the time you've eaten something afterwards, if you had nothing beforehand, you wouldn't have any nutrients coming in until an hour after you finish training your chest.
Right,
It's
right.
probably not ideal. But if you've had a decently sized meal beforehand, you're not going to be post-absorptive till long after your workout. You're going to have those nutrients coming in. So the problem is solved. And here's the thing where context matters, especially if your GI tends to get disruptive, or for whatever reason you just don't want you train better when your stomach is empty. Getting a good training stimulus is important, especially if you've been training for a while, and we're talking about eking out those effective reps. If you go in and you feel like you're going to vomit before your set of squats, and because you're so bloated from drinking a massive then that doesn't serve your purpose at all.
Right.
I'd rather have someone wait 3 hours and maybe not have ideal intra-workout nutrition coming in, and be able to train like a monster, and be pretty diligent, get something in soon thereafter, despite all the the crazy memes and the funny videos about rushing to get to your post-workout window.
Right. Yeah.
Still important, I think. So here's where there's so many aspects to the context. So let's say they're eating massive amounts of food. So they're not they're up to thousands and thousands. They're at 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day, and they're not doing an intra-workout, and they don't normally do one. I found, and other people have found too, I've talked to many people, had clients that do this, that you can kind of have a multitasking phenomenon going on where you basically use that time to bring food in while you're training. So you have large meals, you have a meal 2 hours beforehand, then you have a meal 500, 800 calories during your workout, and then you have a meal an hour after your workout. So instead of having 2 hours beforehand, nothing during your workout, and then a meal, half an hour, because it takes you time to get home from the gym to get to your food, let's say, instead of those 3.5 hours with no food coming in, you've managed to get 800 calories in. It can help people distribute their food over the course of the day, as long as that meal intra-workout doesn't mess up their digestion.
Right.
So the whole weight training is sort of an unnatural act, like I always say. It's a bizarre thing to pick things and put them up down. We're trying to hack our genetics and evoke a muscular callus and all the muscles that we train. So it's also backwards to be exercising really intensely while you're taking in food. You've got all the sympathetic activation, which is not what you want when you're trying to get your digestion going, and all the parasympathetic processes that are involved. So you're not going to have good chemical breakdown, not going to have good mechanical breakdown of your food, and that's why people will use essentially pre-digested protein sources like a hydrolyzed whey, hydrolyzed casein, and more absorbable carbohydrate sources like a highly branched cyclic dextrin. That's
Right.
the point of those. So you're just making use of the food technology to get those calories in, and make it easier on yourself maybe the rest of the day. If you wake up in the morning, let's say, though, it's a different situation. Now you're fasted. You're in a negative protein balance. And now you've trained, if you have nothing there, you've gone another hour and a half, 2 hours, because you've got some time to get up, put your clothes on, get to the gym, or walk down to your basement gym or whatever it might be. Then it makes sense to try to use an intra-workout. And this is where, if you look at the studies comparing like protein versus no protein,
Right.
a lot of times they're doing those in post-absorptive scenarios where someone doesn't have any food coming in. It's in the morning when they're fasted. That's when it makes a difference.
Right.
In some cases, that's where you definitely see it with protein versus no protein. And like some of the early studies with Tipton, for instance, he's done a lot of this stuff. He trained a lot of the good people that are out there doing this research. So those things like essential amino acids, I prefer actually a whole protein source. You can run low on the non-essentials too.
Mm-hmm.
If you're turning on protein synthesis at a fast rate, it makes sense. And Stu Phillips' lab, Churchill Ward, is the first name on one of these studies where they found that like just taking in essentials doesn't give you everything that you need, and eventually protein synthesis can come to an earlier standstill if you don't have non-essentials in the system. So that's the basic idea. Now, if so, it's a way to get more food in. It's a way to ensure that you've got the nutrients there for recovery. If someone's doing like 2-a-days, which I'm not for at all, that's not a bad idea. Let's say you're going to train, you're doing a high volume type of thing. You want to make sure your glycogen levels are plenty high. That's important. So I'm trying to think if I missed any part of your question.
No, you did. I think it's interesting to think of one of the, I wouldn't say it's a nice thing, but like when you get to the point that you're not really progressing anymore, one of the, I guess, fun things for somebody who likes to play around like I do is, early in those years, any time that's not spent gaining a lot of muscle, you feel like it's wasted time, right? It's almost like you almost feel stressed that you're not gaining. Whereas now, there's kind of some acceptance in it. And if I gain a quarter inch on my arms, I mean, that's like a big deal. Not to mention that I could see every difference because everything's been the same. I've measured, I've taken calipers, waistline, everything so many times that I can see these small changes. And so it's kind of like, okay, if I, get down to like my leanest, I can play around with some of these variables and I'll notice if I try an intra-workout carb, I really will notice that. Whereas like if I was going to gain 5 pounds of muscle this year anyway, you might not notice some of those things. So I think it's kind of interesting to play around with it. And one of the things I was actually I've never done blood flow restriction, for instance. And when I finished, I was going to say, hey, is that going to help me at all? Probably, I'm guessing not the best thing to mix with DC training if I'm going to try to give DC a fair shot.
Well, his calf training protocol is a blood flow restriction training protocol.
Essentially, in a way, yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Like that's the thing that's very interesting, is that's what he kind of settled on for calves. And when you sent the questions to me, I thought of this guy, and it didn't occur to me when you were asking about bringing up weak muscle groups, because it wasn't with an exercise choice that he did this. But I met a guy in the gym, and I was actually. Another guy was doing blood flow restriction, and I can't remember what he was kind of dropping the ball. And how
do you mean?
I can't remember what he was doing. He was using a knee wrap, but he didn't have them very tight. Like he just barely wrapped them around. It wasn't enough to make any difference.
Okay.
For what it's worth, the pump sets and fortitude training, I've read a couple different studies, anywhere from about 40 to 60% of an MVC, maximal voluntary isometric contraction, will prevent blood flow into a muscle. So you create an occlusion effect as long as you maintain muscle contraction. And that's why when people do the pump sets, I have them and this is true for all the sets, kind of in part for another reason, but during the pump sets, as long as you're not stopping and resting like you would with the Widowmaker, you've got an occlusion effect, a blood flow restriction effect going on. And you can, even if like you're holding a dumbbell or a barbell and just resting in front of yourself, you can lower the tension just enough to allow the reperfusion, and you'll get a reperfusion. So reactive hyperemia is the fancy word people use for it. And you'll flush out those metabolites. And what that does, of course, is allows some fatigue recovery, and that changes the activation pattern versus if you just kept on going continuously. So that's why
Does
people
his
stop.
stretch then because he'll advise those really long stretches. Does that keep you in inclusion?
Yeah, because you're holding the weight.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the cab machine because some cab machines I can almost just relax in a stretch, like it
Yeah,
just pushes
you
back.
you may be able to, but in most cases, you still got so much tension. If it's still like half of an MBC,
Yeah,
you're still going to have some tension. And plus all the fascia of the muscles now stretched out.
right,
So you can imagine, like, if it's a resting shape and just like you're not contracting versus you stretch it out to maximal
right,
length,
right.
that's pretty much where your fascia is going to be tight. I haven't seen anyone study that. I've just seen like the isometric contractions at anatomical position. But the stretch plus the fact you're going to have some contraction.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
You're,
it's certainly not easy.
yeah.
Resting is not the right term.
Yeah, not at all. So
Yeah.
that's a blood flow restriction thing. So what that does, and that's why the weight has to be, and this is actually kind of the going hypothesis as to why blood flow restriction is an effective way to produce muscle growth with light weights, is that you alter the activation pattern. So normally, as you start off a regular set and you start using the low threshold motor units, the type 1 fibers predominantly, and you go to the type A's and type 2X's. When you get to those final reps, assuming you can fully activate the muscle, all the motor units are available at the maximal firing rates. That's what happens when you reach failure. And that's a function of fatigue. The motor units you start using initially start to get tired. They're fatiguing because they've been used. Metabolites are probably involved with this fatigue process. So metabolites and metabolic stress builds up. And then more motor units need to be recruited and called upon in order to keep doing the set, keep lifting the weight. And if you pause, which people will do because they just sort of, their body says, well, one, it hurts.
Mhm.
And you just learn, like, if you take rest, this is what Widowmakers are about. You rest in between, you flush out those metabolites. That's part of it. You also reduce the energy demand too, so you're just holding the weight. It's less stressful than actually moving the weight back and forth. But flushing those metabolites permits recovery. And that makes the next rep easier than if you just kept on going.
Right.
So when have people do pump sets, I want them to keep on going because what that means is that the fatigue comes on and the metabolic stress is high, and you go from using the low threshold, the moderate threshold, to the very high threshold, only at the very maximal effort threshold motor units more rapidly because you bring on fatigue more rapidly because you don't have any release of the metabolic stress. It's
Right.
continuous because the reps are continuous because you've got enough tension to do that as long as you don't stop.
Right.
If you stop just briefly, like the blood will flush through and
Yeah.
it doesn't take much. You could see, like, I see it all the time. People will do like even heavy stuff, and I'll watch them on Instagram, and they'll just have like a little bit of, like, if it's a 3-second rep, they'll just do like a quarter, a half a second rep,
Yeah.
and that will let you get 2 or 3 more reps.
The
So,
I've been
so
doing squats recently just because I took them out for a long time.
uh-huh.
Again, the heart concerns, and because of the limited equipment, I've been doing them, after my leg curls and leg extensions. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to use lighter weight and just constant tension. And I'm using about half of the weight I used to. And now, again, I was fresh in the past, but it is so hard to not
Don't
just
come all the way
lock
up.
out.
Yes.
Oh my God, it's so much harder. I'd rather add 100 pounds and lock out at the top, but it's
Right.
very hard for sure.
Yeah. You want to stop. Like, you're like, I want to take a break.
Yeah.
And it was the hardest thing for me. I was used to doing Widowmakers with DC training. So when
Right.
I
Right.
what that, I mean, there's a couple things it does. One, it means lighter weight. It also means, like, you've got that as a controlled aspect of your sets. So you're not getting more reps because you're just learning how to better manage fatigue by taking breaks between your reps and eking them out like with a Widowmaker. And it also means less stress on the nervous system because those last, like, max effort reps, those are the quote unquote effective ones. But there's a give and take. You pay the piper in terms of your nervous system. The more of those last max effort reps you do.
Right.
So like Widowmakers, like, that's why Dante doesn't have people doing them for everything, because that you can't get away with too many of
Yeah.
those and come back to fight that just rip you apart.
Right.
So yeah, the blood flow restriction does that. You can do that, and I have another article on Alita. It's in my article, Rust Proofing the Iron Warrior.
Okay.
Which Dave,
I know the title.
yeah,
Oh,
Dave asked me to write it. When we were talking, he's like, I was like, what about an article on this? Like, I think I can do one on that. So I have a bunch of thoughts in there for like older lifters.
Okay.
But one of them is ways to do what essentially kind of pump sets. You can do sets where you basically do holds, like a DC training type of thing, where you do, instead of like one rep and then bring it down and do a stretch, you can do multiple reps and then do a hold. And that's an option for all the pump sets.
Yeah, right.
So that just brings the set to fatigue more quickly, and you've got, with that metabolic stress, you've got a different activation pattern that brings you right up to closer to activating the muscle completely more rapidly. And that's what kind of, if you're looking at it from a perspective of getting those effective reps, if you're someone who's highly trained and you're thinking those effective reps only happen at the very end of the set, so you can't stop 3 or 4 shy of failure, you have to go to like 0 or 1. Having continuous tension like that brings you up to those max effort, maximal activation reps more rapidly.
Mm.
So with less stress on the nervous system, that's a good trade-off. You're getting that, so at least part of the aspect of that muscular stimulus that you want, without the inroads into your nervous system that comes from repeatedly doing like the almost failure reps over and over and over again.
Right. So basically, and so it sounds like for people who want to give DC a shot, you would recommend, obviously as written, you would include those pulses, because you could always take them out if you feel like you're beat up.
I think so, yeah.
And you feel like blood flow restriction on top of that would almost be redundant, because by that point you're almost getting that effect.
Well, I mean, blood flow, there's so many ways to do it. Like the blood flow restriction, this is what I didn't quite get around to telling you. I knew there's something. There was a guy I saw that day in the gym.
Right.
Who saw us doing that. And he's like, here, let me show you something. And I hadn't seen him before. This is at the North Powerhouse here in Tampa. He was a competitor. And he's like, I love the blood flow restriction. He showed me before and after. I mean, he just came to me with this story because he saw you could tell I was a competitor. This other guy was too, and he was. And he showed me before and after of his quads. And his quads went from, a good set of quads are pretty balanced, but they weren't like giant. He wanted better legs. And he wanted to go from, maybe it was men's physique to, I don't know if they had classic at the time, to like open bodybuilding. His quads went from, pretty good, nice separation, to holy shit.
Really?
I should have had him send me the photos. Friggin' ridiculous.
Just from adding blood flow restriction?
But the blood flow he was doing the standard protocol that's been replicated a number of times. And I had the sense in talking to him, you could tell when someone is just like, I could just tell like pain wasn't going to slow him down.
Yeah.
He had like this sense about him, like that's a guy who's going to dig in, because a little bit of a not a braggadocio, like, look how awesome I am, I'm the biggest dude in the gym type of thing. He wasn't a gigantic dude. I could just tell, you have a sense with, like Navy SEALs, Special Forces guys, like these guys are fucking hardcore. They're very modest, but they're badasses. I had that vibe from him, and he was doing the standard reps, which is, I can't remember how you pick the loads that you can finish this protocol in some way, shape, or form. But you start off, apply the tourniquet, and you do a set of 30. And stop, rest, keep the blood flow restriction in place, rest a minute, and then try to do 3 more sets of 15 with a minute's rest in between the last.
How are you measuring for like an average person who doesn't have like a blood pressure cuff type 1, how are you measuring the proper amount to torque it, like to tie it?
Yeah, I'll send you there's a paper out there with it's called like a practical, I think Jeremy Lenicky put it out, and he's the guy who's really he's sort of pioneered this whole area. To be honest, he's doing some really cool work.
Okay.
But he's got it's like a practical guide to blood flow restriction, something like that.
Okay.
And so I think it's something like, read the paper, please, people, because the one thing about this that concerns me is there's a possibility of a clot. You've got blood pooling. Yeah. And so this is why I don't suggest people do blood flow. One thing I wanted to add potentially in fortitude training, because that's sort of that metabolic stress and what that does, the things I just talked about. or what is basically happening with the pump set, but you can evoke that by maintaining stretch and or tension during the course of a set. So it's much easier, of course, if you're doing knee extensions, which what all this guy did was knee extensions. But I think he did that like 3 or 4 times a week, maybe. There's a study by, I think it was a Japanese group, that shows the fastest, and this is one I cite in the Fortitude Training book, and the fastest rate of muscle growth in Wernbaum's review from 2007, where they looked at dozens, maybe 100 studies at least, looking at muscle growth, was done just over 2 weeks. So it wasn't a long-term study, but they quantified in terms of rate of muscle growth on a per week basis. And it was done with blood flow restriction twice a day, 6 out of 7 days a week for 2 weeks in the quads, I believe, using this protocol. So this guy, like, his quads were just crazy, ridiculous. So you do a knee extension, let's say, and you just leave the tourniquet on, or they would use, knee wraps. I think it's like pull it to like a subjective 8 out of 10, 10 being like tight as you could go, 8's.
Right.
You don't need much, and it actually makes a difference depending on how tight you go.
Yeah.
And then you just take your foot out of there, and you've got the blood flow restriction is in place. The thing is, you don't want complete, utter 100% occlusion.
Right.
You want some flow. And there's a risk of clot. The guy who came up with this, the Katsu training, Saito, I think is his name. Like, he's got some literature documenting there's a risk of clots.
Really? So he's actually seen examples of clotting happening.
Yeah, I can look it up here for you. But
you don't feel that that's a risk with, like you were saying, how the pump sets essentially create that occlusion. Obviously, I guess it's just less of an occlusion.
Well, yeah, you'll create it during the set, but so the blood flow occlusion this way, you're like sitting there for like a minute. You're under complete occlusion for,
right.
If we add the minutes together, 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 or 6 minutes total with the whole set. But you can get that occlusive effect just by doing high rep sets, as long as you keep the reps continuous.
Right. Okay.
So that's just basically another way to do resistance training, to be honest, and just keep going. That's different than having something artificial that's mechanically compressing the vessels. And let me see if I can find this paper. There's an interesting study. This one just popped up. I'll mention it too, which is, I think your listeners will be interested. There's a study by Donkel et al. And this idea is like whether this metabolic stress in and of itself is a stimulus, or if it just impacts activation in some way. And they trained one arm normally, and the other arm they trained with the same protocol. It's like 2 or 3 times a week, 3 sets of 10, something like that. And they applied blood flow restriction post set afterwards. So of course, you get a nice pump from training, and then you imagine if you apply the occlusion afterwards, you get this massive pump that you just kind of have to endure ex post facto. There were both men and women in the study. The effect wasn't significant in the men, but in the women that actually impaired muscle growth.
Okay, weird.
And normally, if anything, you see an enhancement of muscle growth when you add restriction. So you can take sets that don't go to failure, and with the blood flow restriction on top of that, that then gives you muscle growth. That's the idea that, this is the blood flow or the metabolic stress is a contributor to muscle growth in some way. But if you add it after the fact, when there's no tension being produced, meaning it's not impacting the activation during the sets themselves or the nature of the stimulus to the muscle, because you're just enduring the blood flow restriction, it can actually impair the muscle growth. So it may be because it's just in sort of an old school way, you're impairing the nutrient supply to the muscle during that period of recovery in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, it's kind of fascinating. So it's the blood flow restriction is helping to create fatigue and thus alter the activation pattern. And I tell you what, especially with calves, if you decide to do calf blood flow restriction training with the tourniquets, it's a type of pain that is categorically different than anything you've ever done in the gym. Even the DC training.
Well, I have, so I've done like 100 rep calves every single day. I've done DC's, the standard calf protocol. The worst, the most unpleasant was probably the treadmill one, because it's just so long. Like, you know, the 15
Right.
minute, you're just hanging over it. That was every day. I just dreaded that. This is awful, but still no growth. So I will try anything once for calves. I'm happy to even like document it, but you know, obviously I'm skeptical. But yeah, I mean, I would give it a shot, sure.
Yeah, I mean, just with your clotting issue, I wouldn't suggest it. It's obviously your choice, but
Yeah,
it's just the nature of the pain. Like there have been times when I felt like the muscle was just going to tear.
yeah.
And I've actually got tears in both my calves anyway, but I felt like I'm
Okay.
going to just tear them like completely. Like it's just going to be a complete rupture. And it
Jeez.
kind of concerned me. Like, yeah, it's like, and I pushed pretty hard, and I would sometimes use too much weight, though I wouldn't get all 15 in the last set. But it definitely does something. And the reason I bring that up is not, you know, to wave the badass wand or something like that. It's just to say
Right.
this is it feels different. It's substantially different. You can
Something's just
just
different.
tell. Yeah, and I think it's a function of bringing on that fatigue. You can do the high rep, low weight sets, and as long as you are taking, this is what the general thrust of the literature is, if you're going to failure, you're going to get the muscle growth. If you
Right.
just do the reps and stop short, you don't get enough effective reps, so to speak.
Right. 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 Right.
So the blood flow restriction is creating, it's uniquely evoking fatigue that's altering the activation pattern, at least to move you more rapidly through those motor units, so you get to the high threshold ones.
Hmm.
The other thing too, like one of the theories as to why novel exercise, why just starting off, if you're untrained or haven't been training for a while, or if you switch exercises, even though they're both types of pull downs, one's with free weights, one's with machine or whatever it might be, you get sore, is that the activation pattern is different. And this
Right.
fits with the whole idea of neural learning and why you get stronger even though you might not be getting any bigger. Most of the strength gains are neurological. People can triple their strength from beginner to advanced, and they don't have 3 times the muscle mass.
Right. For sure.
So changing activation pattern, especially if it's a way that sort of creates a poorly developed one, where maybe some motor units are turning on and turning off in an uncoordinated fashion. Well, that can just simply create sort of asymmetries in the stress and the tension around the muscle. So you've got, like, imagine like each of my hands represents a motor unit side by side, and one's contracting, the other one's not, and they're like contracting like sort of unfused tetanus, and they're kind of literally tearing across one another. And you can see that when people are pushing heavy weights, they'll get
Yeah.
an inhibitory thing with the Golgi tendons, and they'll just be shaking. That can be happening on a much smaller level in the muscle when you're doing something that's totally novel or creates a stimulus that throws off your activation pattern. And the blood flow restriction does. You can't do nearly as many reps. It hurts like shit.
Yeah.
It
I'm
hurts just
sure.
literally. It's like some people just will stop. It's the type of thing. I mean, to be honest, like from just simply a very practical, if the pain were not an issue, you can use lower weights. You know, it just takes like 5 or 6 minutes. You
Right.
just wrap up and you do your sets and you're done.
Yeah.
But it's just too brutal for most people to want to endure.
Believe it. Yeah, it's funny,
Yeah.
after not having done the squats for so long and then doing them after quads or after extensions and curls and then keeping that constant tension, I like can't stop myself from shaking on the last few reps. Like I get up and I'm just like, "Ugh," and then just each
Yes.
rep.
That's
It's
what
funny.
that is. Like that,
Yeah.
the pain and the nociception will also inhibit the alpha motor neurons too.
Right.
So you just can't, like, and some of it can be here, it can be central drive. Like that study, the Ikai and Steinhaus drive, where they hypnotize people and
Mhm.
they were finding anything that could disinhibit and sort of let you, let loose. So,
Right.
maybe if you were on some painkillers, like, people used to use, what was the painkiller that everyone was like, got highly, it was big in bodybuilding for a while. People were getting addicted to it.
Oh.
It was an opiate, like really nasty opiate. Anyway, I can't recall, but you could just train like, a madman.
Yeah.
You didn't feel anything,
Right.
so that's why people were using, partly they just got addicted to it eventually, but
Sure.
that was their sort of initial idea, is that, no pain, then you'll get much more gain,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So
Right.
to speak. So,
All right, man. Well, we so much talked about here. I'm
yeah.
sure I will be splitting this podcast up into two, maybe even three. We'll see.
Yeah, we went like 3 hours, I
We
think.
went a
No,
long
not quite,
time,
but two and a
but
half.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was great. A lot of different topics we bounced around, so I really appreciate you taking the time. So people should know obviously about your Fortitude training book, your bodybuilding book. You want to talk about that, your own bodybuilding coach, and where people can find your stuff.
Yeah, you could just Google Scott Stevenson bodybuilding. It's Dr. Scott Stevenson, drscottstevenson.com. The Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. It's funny. It's always going to be like kind of against the grain because coaches are just, it's a de facto, like you got to have a coach. You can't do it on your own. But for people who want to like have sort of a general guideline or like kind of a roadmap, if they want to do it on their own and reap what I think are some of the greatest benefits that can kind of carry over the rest of your life, like bodybuilding can bring about so many insecurities. And, especially because it's your body we're talking about. It's the vessel that our ego thinks we're carrying ourselves about in. And if you can learn to sort of be confident and okay with that in the way that bodybuilding, or just sort of tending to your physique in the way that bodybuilders do, that is such a challenge to your sense of security and self for so many people, that in overcoming that and learning how to deal with that, I think it's a tremendous builder of confidence and carries over in so many other ways. So that's why I put the book together, because it's been one of the things that's helped me become who I am, be that good or bad. But bodybuilding has served me in so many ways. And I've just kind of like said, I'm going to do what I can to learn this on my own, because it's that challenge. As people always say, that you can count the memes, but if life's easy, you're not going to grow. It's the difficult times that bring about the growth. So that book is to try to give people a little bit of, sort of a pocket guide to figuring out how to use bodybuilding as a way for them to evoke personal growth through learning things, being a geeky scientist like the two of us, struggling in the gym, all the stuff that bodybuilding can do for us.
Very cool, man. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome, my friend.